As a country of 220 million people, we need to be spending 10% of our GDP or $35 billion a year annually in developing our infrastructure for our growing population, for our young population.
From my point of view, we spend a lot of time tracking the poverty numbers here in Pakistan, and it's rising, unfortunately. There are now 27 million children out of school here in Pakistan, and 3 million of those are out of school directly as a result of the devastating floods we saw last summer.
We have seen the devastation that our floods have caused, and honestly, this was a preventable situation if we had just invested in our agricultural irrigation infrastructure better.
Considering the fiscal constraints, the government is now encouraging the private sector, including financial institutions, to play a greater role in building and maintaining sustainable infrastructure projects.
With the aid drying up and the fiscal space narrowing down and no future or a near-term respite in the sight, I believe the burden in terms of funding would be depending on the non-banking financial sector.
If I were to plot a 10-year GDP forecast for Pakistan, the requirement is around, and the backlog of infrastructure, the requirement is around 5 trillion rupee a year for project financing and infrastructure financing. Not going to happen through this kind of funding pot.
We really need to set out our stall to crowd in private sector investment into climate resilient infrastructure. That's absolutely essential.
If you want the private sector involved over here, it actually requires a significant shift, because you have to go from the government being the owner and the manager and the provider of infrastructure to actually being the enabler and the facilitator.
Total infrastructure financing requirement is close to about $124 billion over the 2016 to 2040 period. And as an economist, we need to sharpen our pens and pencils and work out how much revenue we need to mobilize to provide public investment to leverage private investment. And that's the way to go based on my Asia Pacific experience.
The use of aid is fading for Pakistan. The world has run out of patience with regards to constant aid programs. So more and more it's about what projects do you have, are they commercially viable, can they be made commercially viable, and can we raise that financing locally.
The largest repository of liquidity in Pakistan are the banks, as Farooq said rightly. And if they are not very progressive, if they are not taking the step forward, then that repository will never be out there for developmental projects.
One of the key things that we have to figure out how to break is that you need to have liquid and deep secondary markets. Even in the US, no one will invest for 30 years if they didn't know that they could, if after 1 year or 10 years, be able to sell in the secondary market.
So infrastructure bond, I think it's not promoting infrastructure bonds. It's actually the need of the hour.
Normally when we do a bond transaction, we'll work with those investors and we will typically guarantee 100% of that bond.
So 100% of the credit risk you're willing to take of the project?
We will take that, and that actually allows those investors to actually see the project, understand Guarantco and what makes us comfortable and the credit lenses that we look through.
We already have a financing from Guarantco, and we look forward towards doing more transactions of this sort, because if we need to ensure that the system is maintained and it is extended in case of demand, those cables and those meters, poles, transformers, grids, power generation, they have to be there.
So people will say, well, that's all well and good, but look what is facing Pakistan today. We heard some of the challenges that Maheen talked about. Are these not markets where we would generally retrench from? I would say exactly the opposite. this is the time we need to double down in these countries because the need is greater than ever. We should not be a fair weather friend, we should be a friend in need.
As guarantors and with Guarantco and with PIDG support, there is a tremendous amount of firepower available on our balance sheet, on Guarantco's balance sheet, and we're trying to do all of this in PKR terms, so in local currency terms, thereby taking the burden of the exchange rate off company balance sheets. This is a very powerful instrument to have in this market. It is very difficult to raise dollar-based financing for Pakistan or even to service that dollar-based financing for the country. So we need to be able to use our local banks and our local capital markets, develop our bond markets more significantly so that this financing can actually happen in Pakistan currency as opposed to foreign currency, which is what we have been doing for the last 20-30 odd years.